I just always have a confidence from the year. What are you gonna do?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. What are you gonna do?
Yeah.
Dan, right off the bat.
This is when we get to the point of the year where every episode starts with us charting the onset of winter and
Yeah, onset of
how it's
winter.
making us feel.
Well, the last episode we were like, hey, cool, we can do with a bit of fall, with a bit of autumn. How cool. And then it's been really shitty weather here. And I've been like, right, it gets cold and wet this time of year and dark. That really sucks. So that's about where I'm at. I'll be feeling like this until April.
Right, great.
Right. What are you going to do? Something to plug right up front, Dan. I've literally never plugged anything before on the podcast, but I am going to plug something on the pod right now. Not this weekend. If you're listening to this right when it comes out, not tomorrow, but the Saturday after that. So I believe Saturday the 12th. Let me just double check that. Yeah, Saturday the 12th of October. If any of you perverts are in London, I'm going to have a table at the London Anarchist Book Fair. Come say hello. I'll be selling a whole bunch of bullshit and communist stuff and not communist stuff and fun things. And if you are nice to me, I'll give you a discount on it. And it would be cool to see some of you. So London, it's at, I don't know, just look it up. London Anarchist Book Fair. It's a massive thing. A bunch of people are going to be there. Credisticuffs, friends of the show, are going to be there. Bunch of other really cool people are going to be there. Come say hi. It's going to be very, very cool. I think it's at a place called Rich Mix this year. I should check because I need to get a train ticket. It's like Whitechapel, Shoreditch general area. Come say what's up. It's going to be very fun. I'll have a table, sell like a bunch of stuff. Some of it I wrote, some of it I didn't write. So there you go. That's this week's plug.
There you go. You've heard it.
Made me a bit uncomfortable doing that.
You want to be the guy that wanders up to Jack and tells him to read Wilhelm Reich, or
yeah, be that guy.
Non-ironically criticizes Maoism, you know.
Yeah, exactly. Be that guy. Yeah. Whoever can come up with the best way of telling me off for having Marxism on my table will get something free. How about that? Because it's always funny when somebody does that.
At the Anarchist Book Fair.
At the Anarchist Book Fair. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So yeah, come hang. Right. There's usually a bunch of other stuff going on too, not just people like flogging zines and stuff like that. So it'll be cool. Be very, very cool. And these events are just fun. You actually meet people that think like you. How often does that happen? You know what I mean? So yeah, exactly. And you can come and tell me that I'm much shorter in real life because I'm only like 4'7" in real life. So that'll shock some of you. What are you gonna do? We need a Cornish Anarchist Book Fair, Dan, so I can come down there again.
Come down and I'll just start one.
Yeah, the Cornish. It'll just be
we'll have a zine fair.
Yeah, a zine fair. That'd be sick, actually. I'm sure there's one down there somewhere.
Yeah,
very far away.
Yeah. Jack needs an excuse to come and see me.
So. Yeah, so yeah. What am I gonna do? Just go see Dan?
Come on, what a fucking long way.
I was gonna go down there for a gig that didn't wind up happening, but. Yeah, what are you gonna do? Shame. I'll be down at some point. Yeah. Anyway, Dan, how you doing? Are you excited to talk about this week's stuff? You right before this, Dan was just like, I have nothing to say.
Yeah. Oh, I am excited. It was a fun read. Yeah. Very.
It's good.
I don't know. You know. I have nothing to say.
Nothing to say. Well, because you have nothing to say, let's just get right into it.
Let's do some talking. Yeah.
Let's do some talking.
Classic auxiliary statements by
yeah, let's just go for it. I don't fucking know. Yeah. This episode, Dan, we're back on our left communist bullshit where we
did we ever leave?
Did we ever leave? Not recently. No.
How long can we stop putting? Yeah, not.
When can we stop?
How long can we put off just admitting that we're left communist now?
Yeah. Hey, we read Lenin every now and then.
Oh, yeah,
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So yeah, we've made noises about reading Kautsky in the past. So get off our case. We're reading something by a dissident Hong Kong-based left communist that was written in the 1980s, I believe. This is something we've talked about doing for a while. I'm very glad we're doing it. The essay that we read is called "The Capitalist Nature of the Socialist," in quotes, countries, a politico-economic analysis. This was originally published in International Correspondence, and then because the guy's Chinese, I believe, it was originally published in either Cantonese or Mandarin or something, and that was then published in a bigger volume called Two Texts for Defining the Communist Program, I believe. But we're only reading one of those texts, which is the aforementioned capitalist nature of the socialist countries. Kind of like a classic of the left com canon, I'd say, because this person was like alive when the Soviet Union, and wrote this when the Soviet Union was still kicking barely, and when obviously like some people were still pretending that China was communist. So it's very, very interesting. Basically what this is just a criticism of people who think that those places were ever socialist or communist or whatever. And it's written in that classic left com kind of like, every now and then you get like sentences or paragraphs in italics and all caps being like, you are an idiot, this is not correct. Although unfortunately it was written before the Invisible Committee, so we can't do our classic left com test of these things, which is how long does it take before the like ultra leftist cites the Invisible Committee and, you know, the insurrections thing. So, but I'm sure we'll be doing that soon with some things we got on the horizon.
He gets close to the commune state, doesn't he, or various iterations thereof. So.
Which is right around the corner. So yeah, it was very good. It was very enjoyable, I'll say.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it in those terms. As a rare case of a text that didn't immediately become horribly dated as soon as the Soviet Union fell, but actually sort of benefited from being written in that period. It gets to write a critique of a present existing socialism with the full sort of unnecessary historical and theoretical scope, I suppose, or from a particular theoretical scope, which allows it an enlightening degree of historical reflection. I'm just putting words together now.
You're doing very well. And to an enlightening degree of historical reflection.
Welcome to the episode of Auxiliary Statements where Dan describes what talking is.
Yeah. And what we're going to do is discuss that enlightening aspect of that text.
Word salad, mumbo jumbo. Yeah, I mean, I like it. I mean, in some ways, this is our first foray into the sort of like the weighty Marxist topic of what kind of mode of production was the Soviet Union, you know, or how should one accurately describe the political economy of the Soviet Union? And initially, this text starts, and I thought, okay, we're going to have a really well worked out sort of like weighing of the pros and cons of all the various different descriptors, be it state capitalism or deformed worker state, or I don't know, some kind of bureaucratic collectivism, new class society, whatever. But no, what actually needs to happen is a reiteration of one of Marx's various polemics from 150 years ago, because you know these things can go no other way than that.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, I jest because it is, yeah, you know. We'll get onto it.
Yeah, it's just value theory in the end. It's like a smoke screen, and then it's just value theory. The funny thing is, though, is you're absolutely right. This definitely starts with him being like, the reason he wanted to write this essay is because he had never really found any of the like Stalinist explanations for what the Soviet Union is, or any of the other quote unquote like socialist countries, or the Trotskyist explanation of like degenerated worker states, or the like new class society explanations for any of these countries. He never found any of those compelling. And he sets himself the task of basically just defining what capitalism is, and then defining what socialism is, and then weighing what actually exists in the world and being like, it's all capitalist, is what, spoiler alert, that's what he winds up coming away with. And so, yeah, that first paragraph is him saying, he's just like, these are all bullshit, moving on. It's just very funny. And it's cool because he does the kind of typical thing, which sometimes kind of rubs me the wrong way, just because it's like, yeah, here we go. You're about to be scientific, dude. Where he's like, you need a scientific understanding of what capitalism is to get to communism or socialism, whatever, like eventually, right? To build that. But the argument that he makes is that capitalism is developed spontaneously through private property relations, right? And through the kind of like material history of previous modes of production. Whereas socialism, and I'm just using that interchangeably with communism, has to develop consciously. And so he's saying if there's no actual scientific understanding of what communist social relations are and what capitalist social relations are, then you're going to get a spontaneous mode of production that organizes itself spontaneously, to say that in a roundabout way, and that's just going to wind up being capitalism. No matter how much state interference you have, no matter how many bureaucrats you have, no matter how many red flags you wave, if you have a spontaneous mode of production, it's just going to be capitalism. And he explains this in a really compelling way, as I said, in kind of that classic, like, pithy leftcom way. He gets into loads of stuff that jive really well with the fundamental principles stuff. And weirdly, he mentions the kind of that general group, and he mentions Paul Maddock as having some slight correspondence with them, like German Dutch left communists. But I think it was like a really small, maybe like a letter or two interaction that he has, because I think there was just too much of a language barrier. And it was just kind of, I don't know, something just didn't happen and they didn't really click really well. But a lot of the conclusions in here jive perfectly with the fundamental principles, which we've spoken about at length on the show before. And weirdly, it's written in like a really similar way. It's like that pithy nature where it's like, you're all idiots, all caps, italics, like that's in the fundamental principles and it's here. So it's just something in the water, I think, with a lot of like councilist left communists. It was very funny.
For sure, yeah. I was like, because he makes this declaration that he isn't able to thoroughly research all of that material, and then I was expecting to get something that like maybe a different formula or like a description of what a socialist mode of production predicated on labor time accounting would look like, and actually he settles on very similar formulas with a few different. There are a few little elements that he focuses on in different ways that I think aren't as central to the fundamental principles book, but yeah, a lot of similarities between the two. I really appreciated the kind of like scientific pretensions of this, because what they actually do is really simplify the argument, and it is an argument that we've encountered in various different ways. One that I think we've been trying to formulate ourselves to some extent. Not that we've created it, but something that appeals to us, I suppose. Um, or kind of like natural argument of it is only through a full, thorough analysis of what the capitalist mode of production is, both sort of like in a sort of material economic sense, but also maybe even more fundamentally in this context in a historical materialist sense of like capitalism has emerged out of a sort of developing sequence of various modes of production predicated on the simple necessity of human beings needing to reproduce their existence. And he is taking all the same reference materials as the writers of the Fundamental Principles book do, by which I mean primarily Critique of the Gotha Program and then things that Engels says in Anti-Düring, to highlight how this sort of the same argument that there are like certain mechanisms of capitalism need to be understood and then removed in a certain way to or rather what well I'm trying to sort of like, he doesn't say it in exactly the same way, but this argument of there needing to be a natural development between capitalism and socialism such that there is both a fundamental break, but that fundamental break in his what sort of defines the nature of his scientific analysis is working out what kind of like precise sort of like intervention a conscious revolutionary process needs to make in quite a like scalpel precise way to ease or facilitate the transition from capitalism to socialism. What needs to be gotten rid of, what can be maintained, in what ways are sort of like content and form going to have to shift. I think as we talk about this, it'll become evident that these are mechanisms that we have become quite familiar with readings that we've done recently, I suppose.
Yeah, and you're right to emphasize that, because I think that like that was a main point of emphasis in the fundamental principles, the nature of like what is it that we can do. And in the fundamental principles, they're really funny because they just basically say the labor time certificate, system that Marx talks about in the Critique of the Gotha program and that they kind of expand upon. They're just kind of like, you can do it pretty easily. It's fine. Don't worry about it. Force the people who don't want to do it, but it'll also be real easy. They compare it to just like how capitalist nations have like changed currencies, which I think is kind of funny. And in this, there's actually a moment when he's like, you wouldn't want to do this unless certain criteria are met. So he's a little bit more hesitant to just say you can just do labor time planning and everything will be fine. He actually kind of makes the point that like if you were to do it today, 40 years ago, that and do it all of a sudden, there would be a pretty massive drop in productivity, which I think is interesting and isn't something that I really pondered too much, but I would need to think about it a little bit more. I suppose because he's saying that there are firms that produce above average productivity and that everybody's trying to produce above average productivity, that if they're no longer rewarded for that, the nature of productivity that we're used to would just go away. And that, without a certain degree of force or a certain degree of like nuance, at least in kind of how you adopt labor time planning, it could be really catastrophic. But I mean, at the same time, it is also like an average of productivity that everything is based on. So I'd need to think a little bit more about how that is. There's also a point in here where he's just like, kill the peasants. Anyway, moving on. It's just like, wow, okay, geez. It's not quite that intense, but he's not a fan of the peasants. I'll say that.
Yeah, there are. Yeah, he does sort of like advocate for some certain degree of force in this transition process, I guess.
Yeah.
He does. No, he does. He does. He does paint an interesting model of what it would like. It's strange to imagine him in the 1980s, which I suppose is quite a long time ago now, still imagining himself and any revolutionary process that he might be witness to happening in a world where there is a substantial peasant periphery to a potential like communist core to the world economy kind of thing. But he does in some respects like talk about how that interaction would play out potentially, what the basis for an economic relation might be between a communist world and a peasant periphery kind of thing. And I sort of felt like I expected him to come on, because this is one of the things that is quite interesting about his description of what socialism is, and I can't really remember how much the fundamental principles touches on this. And in actual fact, he doesn't touch on it as much as I expected him to, which is to say, there's two related ideas. One, like if you're going through this transition process, you can't transition your economy in total straight away, and he's envisaging bringing labor time accounting into I suppose certain areas of the economy, but I didn't quite understand how that process was going to happen. And then also there's the relationship to other types of forms of economy still existing, because like obviously I'm always quite excited by references to historical materialism, or rather to analysis of how modes of production have developed, and that sort of historical process that's brought them about, and ideas which like break down this neat binary between, okay, now we're in feudalism and everybody subsists under one particular class relation and one particular mode of production, one particular way of producing, and then we transition to capitalism and suddenly everybody's doing something completely different. And he talks quite a lot, with heavy reference to Marx and Engels, about modes of production having a primary form of production within them, and then lots of different other ways that people produce to subsist alongside that. And what I was expecting was an interesting elaboration of what it would be like to have small amounts of commodity production sitting alongside fully socialized production that was guided by labor time accounting processes, and what that would look like, whether it's all internal to one economy or um, socialist countries relating economically to peripheral commodity producing systems or whatever. It's a short text really, and sort of like he sketches certain things and sketches over certain things, but um, I find it interesting that it was at least sort of highlighting these things.
Yeah, I think, yeah, it was. I would have kind of liked a bit more of an elaboration on that too, but I guess that kind of, I guess in his, defense is not really, I suppose, what he's setting out to do, like put forward a transitional theory, but he did hint at it in a way that I was really interested in. It seemed like what he was focusing on was that there maybe you couldn't have commodity production existing side by side with like communist social relations just because you couldn't really have private property relations at all. Otherwise, that would kind of mess with everything. It seems like what he's saying is that like you would have to negotiate with certain classes that are not necessarily going to be inherently on board. And here, this was him talking about the peasantry. And the way that he comes about, sorting that out is that you basically give them things for cheap, right? You exchange uh, wheat for like, farm tools or whatever at a, lower price or whatever than it would be otherwise to kind of entice them into communist social relations. Again, yeah, I mean, I don't know how much that necessarily plays into our world now. I mean, I'm sure there are regions where you would need to do something like that. Maybe it would be more so about like just in the fundamental principles, they talk about how certain segments of the proletariat aren't going to necessarily be interested in doing this right away for various reasons. Maybe they have pretty cushy jobs or something. Maybe this is kind of like a hint as how you could kind of entice them to, be commies or something. Um, but yeah,
I just I just remembered what you were saying about efficiencies and that question of um, productivity dropping as a result of this sort of transition to this, and I sort of understood the argument that he was making was rather that like one of the sort of like one of the arguments for capitalism is that it has this built-in mechanism which like enforces productivity. It um, or enforces efficiencies upon the workplace, and it forces workers to reach a certain level of productivity, and it forces industries to reach a certain level of productivity to trend toward a certain norm. Um, and he's sort of saying that if you take that away and you simply remunerate everybody for the hours that they work, then on a sort of like individual industry or worker basis, people might then not be they're not going to be compelled in the same way. Um, I only say this because his answer is like it's funny, isn't it? Like sometimes, like this is not me making a sort of like clever critique at left communists. I think I would take similar outs to certain issues, right? But like his here is a very scientific analysis, and I suppose a certain amount of um, the defense that you can make of his argument is caught up in that scientific analysis, right? Because what he's doing is a sort of like abstract sketch of an idea rather than a fully concrete, worked out system. But he does fall back on this sort of vague assertion that this process is only going to happen under conditions of a certain degree of development of working class consciousness. And so, if you do have a working class that is conscious enough to be sort of spearheading this form of transition, then you might reasonably expect them to have a degree of consciousness which doesn't lead them to be quote unquote lazy or whatever, but actually means that they are ideologically minded toward striving to meet a certain level of efficiency, which is seemingly necessary for or seemingly would meet the good of the collective, I guess.
yeah, yeah,
But it is
absolutely.
a classic left com kind of like, oh, but like,
Yeah, everyone's a
the
communist.
commune state and
Yeah,
everyone's a communist,
exactly. But ideology will be fine then. It's not
Yeah.
now. Don't even try it, but it will be in the future. Yeah, and it's funny because I think we get a much more intelligent answer to that question maybe in the fundamental principles where they basically just point to the general ledger and say, look, everybody's going to know if you just fuck off and like, or not you individually, but like your firm, if your firm just like is way below productivity, because prices are going to go up and everyone's going to be like, oh, it's that specific individual firm that's producing way below productivity. And they're going to go, what's going on here? And if it's as simple as people are being lazy, there's going to be a bit of like probably like peer pressure and shaming and being like, come on, what the hell? You're making everything more expensive. There's also the fact that it's like, if you slack off, you are making things more expensive for everyone, including yourself. But then there's also like, hey, maybe people are just really below productivity because they have bad machines. Maybe it's because of imperialism. You know, it's like things cost a lot more in certain countries because they've been forced to cost a lot more, and it'll just be everybody gets together and just, yeah. So it's like, I don't even think you need the kind of left commie argument that he's doing here where he just falls back on ideology and people being good. Or not being good, but being like achieving a certain level of like omnipotent class sentience, which is never going to happen. It's more so just that like, even though when you use direct labor time as your like unit of account and all of that stuff, and you have this labor time certificate system, yes, there isn't that baked in, you know, method of value that disciplines everybody behind their back, but there is still going to be a like societal and kind of self-preservation instinct and not just slacking off. It just won't be to the extreme of efficiency for efficiency's sake, right?
Mm-hmm. And also, he sort of does touch on this argument a little bit when he's critiquing the Soviet Union, but one of the things that seems implicit in the fundamental principles version of this argument is that individual firms won't be operating in competition with one another, but in solidarity, and there would be mechanisms for sharing efficiencies, sharing staff, sharing sort of managerial techniques, shall we say, or like sharing knowledge, such that certain industries that are falling behind can be brought up to a certain industry-wide standard, I suppose.
Yeah, and you'd want to for all those reasons, right? Yeah. It's not like capitalism where you're in competition with everybody. That's kind of the point, is that you've collectivized everything and it's in your best interest. You're tying, this is like the whole point of communism, right? Is that you're tying your individual best interest to the better interest of society too. So yeah, there you go. We solved it. Easy. Everybody can have the consciousness that they want. It's going to happen whether you like it or not. All right. Should we try and get into some of the like value theory stuff in this book? Because this is really what makes it really good. He puts forward a definition of capitalism here that is as simple as it is enticing, where he basically just says commodity production is as simple as two things: as private ownership of the means of production, right? Which he takes pains to point out is not a legal category. It's not just because you have a bourgeoisie that recognizes themselves legally as the bourgeoisie that you have private production. It's a social relation, right? Which is very important, and we'll get to that here in a bit. But also you have private ownership and you also have production for exchange, right? Because you can have private ownership of the means of production in isolated groupings and not have generalized commodity production, right? Like you can have peasants like at the very beginning of the United States who were kind of, you know, hampering the creation of capitalism because they were just producing all of their own clothes and producing all of their own feed, and they were pretty self-sufficient, more or less, right? But that isn't necessarily capitalism because they're producing everything for themselves, right? They own all of their own means of production, but they're producing it for themselves. That's not capitalism. So you need this kind of second criteria of everything is generally being produced for exchange, right? And from there, he goes on to just kind of have like to build on that, right? To basically say that to get into this whole idea of direct labor time and how the main way that he's criticizing countries for claiming to be communist when in his definition they're just capitalists, they're not even state capitalists, he's just like, these are just capitalist countries, is because they're not using direct labor time as their unit of account. And he basically, the way that he proves that is basically by saying that at its core, like, capitalism cannot use direct labor time, right? So I suppose we kind of have to go back a little bit and talk a little bit about where value comes from and all these different things. So because you have private production, right, there's no real way of centrally coordinating or even just coordinating at all, producing and distributing what society needs, right? Because everybody's in competition with each other. Nobody's even recording really necessarily labor inputs. So there's no real way of planning a kind of distribution of social labor. So because of that, you get this spontaneous creation of a measurement that we call value, which is basically the law of value that disciplines people behind their back. and it makes sure that producers are producing at or above average productivity, right? And the way that it does that is basically by saying, if you're a private producer and you're producing way above average productivity, right? Your firm, if you're a capitalist, right? You're producing like Frisbees at a really high rate because you have like the Frisbee Maker 2000 that nobody else has or something like that. When you go to the market, you're going to want to get as much as you possibly can back for it. And so right now we're just kind of talking in terms of abstract labor and in terms of value, right? So, and in terms of basically like social labor, right? So when you go to the market, you're not going to basically be like, oh yeah, I'll get back in terms of like social labor, I'll get back less than I put into it, or I'll get back like, I'll trade with somebody who's, produced their commodity at really low productivity. What you're going to want to do is get what that labor is worth to society, right? You're going to want to get the average level of productivity's worth of social labor so that you can kind of maximize your profits and maximize the social labor that you're getting back, right? And it's because of that that his whole argument of direct labor time is kind of based on, right? That is why capitalists aren't engaging with the market using direct labor time as a measurement. They're using indirect measurements, kind of like measuring their commodity against every other commodity, right? And it's this weird, spontaneous kind of like very, very like fly by the seat of your pants thing where because nobody's centrally coordinating everything or anything, people are just kind of like left to their own devices to scrounge what they can get back in terms of social labor and try to compete with everybody else to try and get back as much as possible. um, Hopefully that was kind of like explained in a halfway decent way. I always fall
No,
apart
that's
when I
good.
have to try and talk about these things.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the primary reasons to engage in this activity is just to practice talking about
Yeah,
it.
exact practice, so that one day I can do it well.
One day, no. I think it is like I joked at the beginning about how the beginning sections of this text are framed around a polemic, but in some ways, I think it's probably quite worthwhile discussing a little bit how much of this text is centered, at least initially, on Marx's disagreements with a guy called John Gray, who was, I think, an English political economist who proposed why not shift from using value as the measure which governs sort of distribution and sort of general directs production under the economy. Because I think what's interesting about this is even before Marx, it seemed quite clear to people that, and sort of these the sort of like political economists of this era seem to recognize, to at least to some degree, that what sat behind value under a capitalist economy was simply the degree of labor that it took to produce a certain commodity. Now, obviously, there were different iterations of value theory, and Marx and other political economists added certain elements, but this guy John Gray was like, well, why not? Why not? Well, he proposed a system for using labor tokens as a replacement for money in a, I think probably what could be described as a sort of utopian sketch for what an alternative political economic system might look like. And Marx engaged in a critique of this, which seems to be centered around, well, why not? Why not do that? Why doesn't capitalism simply use the amount of labor that it takes to produce a commodity as uh, the sort of price or value that a commodity exchanges for and bears? Why isn't it as cut and dry as that? And for John Gray, it is simply that, well, what John Gray wants to maintain is valuing or pricing commodities with the degree of labor that's gone into making them, but at the same time maintaining private production of commodities, maintaining this portion of what you were describing as this text's like two features of capitalism, maintaining production um, under conditions of private ownership and for exchange, but switching that exchange. So rather than exchanging things against their arbitrary price, you could exchange them on the grounds of something much more concrete, which is the amount of labor that's gone into doing them, to producing them. Um, and then the answer that Marx gives, and the answer that's taken up in this text, is that, well, the very reason why you cannot do that is because things are being produced under these conditions of private production, as you so ably explained. Value is the sort of like spontaneous outgrowth of the capitalist mode of production that comes about entirely by virtue of the fact that production is done privately. All the and we can go back to the reading that we did of Rubin for this, right? Is all that we know about the value of a commodity comes from the process of taking it to the marketplace and comparing it to others. It's only through an exchange that the value of something becomes apparent, and therefore the value of something can only ever be expressed in its exchange value. So without actually doing away with those fundamental things, private property and production of commodities under private conditions for exchange, you could never transition to a form of political economy that organizes itself around accounting, but purely by direct labor time accounting, I guess.
Mm.
So yeah, the sort of like the argument that he's basically making is that we have to strip away all of these fundamental features of what capitalism is to build a socialist economy. And the mistakes that certain people are making, and the reason why he's saying we have to fully understand what capitalism is before we can transition to socialism is predicated on that argument, I think. Anyway.
I think too, like, yeah. I think the idea of Gray's too was that you would have a central bank that would determine the prices that things should be set at in terms of labor time. And Marx's point is like, why would any producer that's producing things above average efficiency ever accept getting certificates back while there are still private property relations, right? Like Gray's mistake is that he assumes that you can keep private property relations and have direct labor time as a measure. But like you absolutely can't do that because that's just a much less stable version of capitalism. And what LLM would say is that that is just capitalism. One of the reasons I love this text is because he's just no bullshit. He's like, it's not state capitalism, it's capitalism. It's either capitalism or it's communism. Yeah. And then basically he turns around and does the other kind of, he analyzes Marx's other kind of famous polemic in this kind of sphere, which is his polemic with Proudhon, which is basically where he says that Proudhon falls into the classic trap that everybody still does. And he calls out a bunch of his left communist friends in his era for doing the exact same thing, where they basically exalt kind of the commodity and they leave money alone, or they kind of, say money is the root of all evil, right? What LLMN here is doing is he's basically saying that money is just a phenomenal form of value. You can get rid of money, you can like burn money or whatever, but value is still going to be operating whether you call it money or like shmoney, or you get rid of it and have a central bank determining everything, right? Like, again, the point is changing the social relations, not the thing, not the phenomenal form of those social relations, right? Because, money is a necessity under private property relations for the same reason that value is a necessity, right? You need to basically have something that facilitates the flow of goods through a completely atomized, competition-based, uncoordinated system, and you get that in money. Money is just the thing that, supposedly represents at its core value, exchange value, all of these different things. And just saying you want to get rid of money would be like saying, I don't know, I want to get rid of all the people driving to the core of Paris because there are too many cars. So I'm just going to make it so that cars can't go anywhere. And then everybody's like, well, there are no trains. What the fuck? Now we just can't get in there. It's a similar idea, right? It's like, you can't just get rid of the phenomenal aspect of value and of capitalist social relations, maintain those social relations and expect everything to be fine, right? Like, this is a mistake that the anarchists of his time made a lot. There's probably a material reason for this, right? Like why like Spanish anarchists tended to kind of do this, probably because there was this exaltation of the kind of like petty producer and the petty proprietor as kind of like, man, it's a kind of libertarian thing, right? It's like, if only big business wasn't getting in the way, these like brave, petty producers could fix everything. But it's like, well, no, you actually need to get rid of private property relations. That's like the whole point. And Men says that you do that through instituting direct labor time as a measure. And, the one quick way to test whether the society that you're planning in your head is capitalist or communist is to basically say, could you use direct labor time as a measure? And would everything fall apart if you tried to do that? Because if so, then you probably just have private property relations still. It's tricky. And this gets into his idea, of why this is not a legal category, private property relations. You can get rid of the bourgeoisie all of you want, but if people are still producing for exchange and, in competition with each other and trying to get as much social labor, maximizing their efficiency back as possible in that exchange, you still have private property relations. And that winds up being his criticism of every single socialist country, saying that's actually what exists.
Yeah, maybe we should try and explain what he means by. Well, I suppose you said that he doesn't like the term state capitalism because the socialist countries are just capitalist kind of thing, but he's broadly advocating for an argument which says, he's arguing for the quote unquote socialist countries that still existed in his time I suppose still exist in ours in some small sort of like increasingly insignificant fashion.
According to Twitter.
As being capitalist, primarily because these fundamental features of capitalist social relations continue to exist. I was saying before we started this, like reading this is probably the most Stalin that I've ever read because he sort of like quotes from Stalin quite ably and quite fully. And what's fun about that is like you can clearly see the positions that is being taken by Stalin and Stalinists as being primarily ideological. They're just sort of like they're recognizing that there's saying that the law of value isn't what defines capitalism. They sort of clearly seem to recognize that the law of value still exists under socialism, so they just need to say, well, that's fine.
That kind of rocks. It's kind of like, all right.
I mean, why not?
Can't argue with that.
Describe the world as you see it and then call it socialist.
Exactly. Yeah. And the world as it actually was, because a lot of times he's quoting Stalin and, various Chinese Stalinists. If we have any Guanmon lock heads in the audience, turn the podcast off now. But like, they'll just be like, as you say, value and money, it exists in the Soviet Union, but that's communism. Or they'll say that's socialism.
By
right?
virtue of the fact that it exists in the Soviet Union.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, I mean, to focus on that too, I guess maybe we should just mention that Stalin, instead of saying that the law of value is one of these fundamental aspects of capitalism, he says that it's maximizing profit, right? And he's like, well, actually, we're not trying to maximize profit, so we're not actually capitalist. And Men just kind of destroys that easily by basically saying every single openly capitalist country on the world does that. Like their state has to interfere with various industries that are, if you left capitalism alone as it should operate, and he makes the point, as kind of Marx assumes it, would, or at least he does in his like broad abstractions and analysis of capitalism, you would expect when there's a very high organic composition of capital, a bunch of different firms that have that high rate to contract to the point where they have an average profitability rate, right? But Men says, well, there's actually a political angle to that because for a bunch of different reasons, he says in the age of imperialism, right? A lot of the kind of like core countries can't let that happen, right? They need to prop up these industries because they can't just let like, US steel, say, completely collapse and go overseas, because then there would just be no steel production, there would be massive losses of jobs, all of these different things. Not to say that that, doesn't actually happen on some level in capitalist countries, but he does say that to a certain extent, capitalist states do this, right? They transfer the total like social surplus between industries to prop up ones that, if you were going by the kind of textbook definition of capitalism, should either contract massively or just fail. And so when Stalin's saying we're not capitalist because we do the things the capitalist state does, men's just like, what are you talking about, brother? Like, yeah, geez, it's so blatant.
It's
It's so
very
funny.
like. Well, I guess I would say that it's very there. It's this. The writings of Stalin in this seem to take very ethical definitions for things. I was about to say it's very vibes based, but I don't really
It's
actually
kind of
know what that
vibes
means.
based. It's just kind of vibes based.
But it's like we let's define capitalism as doing an evil thing, and then say our intention is not to do this bad thing, and because that's our intent, then it means that we're not doing it. Like it makes everything very non-systemic and actually be an outgrowth of people's will rather than outgrowths of the system. And it's even more interesting when Men describes how Stalin and Stalinists talk about what socialism is, because their definitions for it's like it's not so much a definition for socialism. What Men is looking for, and what he quotes Stalin as saying that they are describing, is what are the fundamental laws of socialism. If like the law of value, or for Stalin, like the law of, I don't know what it is, the law of like surplus value or whatever is the fundamental law of capitalism, then Men is trying to define, or asking Stalin and Stalinists to define, the fundamental laws of socialism. And it seems for Stalin like the fundamental law of socialism is actually just a description of nice things that socialism is trying to do. We're trying to create a system whereby like we can have a technological growth that is pursuant of meeting everybody's basic needs and more, and blah blah blah, rather than defining what the fundamental social, like what are the fundamental social relations that will allow for a mode of production that we're going to call socialism to exist and function, before we even get to the point of what is it trying to achieve. What is the good that socialism is going to do. It's like, how are we going to create a system that allows for that to happen, I guess.
Yeah, and it's funny because while you were saying that, I was kind of thinking like, to a certain extent, if you just want to explain this to the average person, you can basically just say communism, socialism, whatever, is as simple as, communally reproducing firms and treating everybody's labor the same in order to get to this level of productivity that we as a society decide, and then that we can direct to purposes that we see fit. It is really that simple. But what Men's saying here is that, like, as you so aptly put, vibes aren't really enough. And it's like, you actually need to understand how you can do that, because he's just saying that is absolutely not possible given the social relations of the Soviet Union, given the social relations of China, Yugoslavia, whatever. It's just not going to happen. And maybe actually on that, we can kind of talk a little bit about his foray into like what he calls primitive communism, so like hunter-gatherer societies, because this is a really interesting point. He is, one of the core things he's doing here is making a distinction between directly social labor and indirectly social labor. And he's saying that socialism will have directly social labor, right? You'll be rewarded for the work that you do, and the work that is done won't be indirectly valued as to what it winds up being worth to society by means of comparing, commodities to one another. And he mentions hunter-gatherer society as basically saying they are using directly social labor, right? When you go out with a bunch of your hunter buddies or a bunch of your like gatherer buddies, I guess, and you're gathering and or hunting, it doesn't matter if you suck at gathering. It doesn't matter if you're like, bad at shooting a bow and arrow or whatever. Like, you're going to get back as much of the social, creation, the social labor as you need. If you go out hunting and you only get like one deer, and like, some other prick gets like 10 deer and they're like this great hunter or whatever, you still get to eat as much as you want. You still get access to that social product as much as you want. And he says, why is that? Because private property doesn't exist. Why is it that nobody gives a shit? Because private property doesn't exist. People just recognize that that's all part of communal society, right? So the trick is like trying to understand how you can do that in a kind of advanced society with the division of labor. Um, and that's where he gets into the labor certificates and all of this different stuff, and about how you can actually treat labor as directly social. Because remember, that's like, if this all sounds complicated, that's all you're really trying to do is just treat all labor as the same, and when you first hear this, you're going to go, as exactly as you said, Dan, at the beginning of this, you're going to go, whoa, communism sounds like it would be incredibly inefficient, because you're not rewarding anybody for the work that they do. They're just showing up, and you work 8 hours, whatever, here's 8 hours of total social labor or whatever. But as we said before, there are ways of kind of like regulating that and tying that good, the social good, to kind of the individual, good, without falling back on the law of value. And it's just interesting. I really thought that was all interesting. I mean, when you hear a lot of people talk about this, I think they kind of get into the kind of like, I don't know, like maybe peer pressure aspects of hunter-gatherer society, which is probably like interpersonal relationships probably really did regulate society, as opposed to like a system of labor certificates, right? Like if somebody was trying their best, you're going to reward them for all of the labor that they do. But if they're just totally slacking off and they're like, yeah, I went hunting today, and they were just like hanging out by the river or something, then they probably wouldn't really get rewarded for it. I don't know how much of that would necessarily be needed under communism. I think that it's less of a like, you're going around hassling people because they're not contributing enough to society, and more of a like, hey, actually everybody being on the same level and benchmark is actually good for everybody, and less of a like peer pressure thing. It's like, oh, me working harder actually helps out to a certain extent, but if we decide that we don't want to work as hard and everybody's fine with that, who cares? You know what I mean? So yeah.
I really like that definition of like, let's start with the very simple aspiration of uh, what a socialist economy would be, in the sense of like, we're trying to have all social product be sort of equally shared, I suppose, and then ask the question, as Men starts this text, like, okay, we are in the position of constantly trying to plan a socialist economy. Really, all you're trying to do is create social technologies for implementing, or to make possible, that form of sort of like economy predicated on directly social labor. And the labor time certificate, is just one particular type of uh, sort of social technology to allow that to happen. Like,
Mm. Yeah, and the communal reproduction of firms too is really important on that
yeah,
aspect too, because it's like that's key to it, right? Is well, if you're treating everybody's labor as equal, what happens to the firms that aren't very efficient? It's like it is in everybody's best interest to make sure that they are at that level of efficiency that we decide, right? One would imagine that a transitional phase would be massively investing in parts of the world that have like what's the opposite of benefited? Have not done very well by imperialism. You know what I mean? To really try and get all of that up to stuff, because it's like, I don't know, people love coffee. You know what I mean? That's not coming from like France. That's not coming from Germany. It's not coming from America. You know what I mean? That's coming from places that have like, yeah, I don't know. So this is all to basically just say that like investing in making things more efficient in that part of the world, that would be better for everybody. And it's not like you're going to get, communist France is like, we don't want to help anybody. It's like, no, you'd actually want to help everybody. That's the point, is that you're communally reproducing everything.
yeah, I really love that. I hadn't really thought about it in those terms before. I don't know how I've never really thought about it in those terms before, but like, yeah, if you're creating the circumstances whereby um, people are not all in it for themselves, not only interested in the productivity of their firm, because that's what's going to materially benefit them, but actually, if you've created a system where people are materially benefited by taking a concern in how other firms are operating, the
Other
conditions,
people.
and the other people. Yeah,
Imagine that.
yeah.
I mean, it's
Yeah,
also
that's great.
ecological too. You know what I mean? Because we've spoken about this before, but it's like, why then would you want a cow that was like, if you're a steak guy, why would you want a cow that was raised in Argentina, packaged in China, and you're eating it in Oklahoma? You know what I mean? Like, that wouldn't make sense. It would just be like, this is ruining my planet. And again, another part of this is which nobody, including, well, nobody in this left communist milieu goes into, because it's a tricky thing to kind of try and impose on people. But like a lot of that is the political nature of this future society, how you would actually make those decisions. Um, And yeah, I mean, that nobody goes into that. This is just about the base. Who cares about the superstructure? You know what I mean? That'll figure itself out. So what are you going to do? Um, Only other thing I wanted to mention, Dan, I don't know if you have anything else, but the only other thing I wanted to mention is that when a lot of people discuss labor time planning and they have a good understanding of it, which is not like many sects out there do have a good understanding of it, and they're arguing in good faith, which most of them are not. It's kind of assumed that the essence of labor time certificates is this idea that you don't treat them like money insofar as, you know, no one can go and buy means of production to start their own business. No one can store up their labor credits. Oftentimes you'll even see people put forward that like they should expire at a certain point. And LLMN is, or that, you know, another insane thing to say is that like you can't, you know, give your certificates to somebody else. LLMN is like, that's psychotic. You would absolutely want that. You're going to tell like a grandma that's worked her whole life that like she can't give like, you know, a labor hour to like her grandkids, you know what I mean? Like, come on, for their birthdays or something like that. Like, that's stupid.
How do you put a labor hour in a birthday card?
That's a good question. Yeah, it's a Bitcoin, the same way you do it with the Bitcoin. Yeah. The example he uses is what? So you're telling people they can't buy lawnmowers? Which I thought was pretty funny. He's like, you'll be able to buy a lawnmower under communism. He's saying that that's not at all the essence of these labor time certificates. That you can't exchange them. And he's actually kind of saying like you should be able to exchange them to a certain extent. He's basically saying that the essence of labor time certificates is that the direct labor of every single producer is treated equally, right? It's this idea that you get what you get no matter what your efficiency, to allow for society to communally reproduce itself as it sees fit. That's the essence of labor time certificates, not that like they expire in your bank account or something like that.
I mean,
like,
it seems like those people who are fearful of people accumulating their labor certificates somehow and then mysteriously becoming corrupted by like capitalist ideology or something, or like accumulating too many lawnmowers and then then what are they going to do with all of these lawnmowers?
Cut a lot of grass.
Like they seem to be slipping into that sort of like Proudhon-esque fear of money, you know, like money is somehow bad, not because it is the phenomenal form of some kind of underlying social relation, but rather that like if we let something that looks a bit like money creep back in, somehow capitalist social relations will be reinstated, even though we've destroyed the base upon which they're built, you know, like if we get rid, if by abolishing the law of value we get rid of economic conditions under which it's necessary to find some kind of token that represents exchange value in the abstract, then we're not like having a labor token isn't somehow going to mysteriously want to fulfill that social role if we've taken away the base for that as a necessity for society.
And this is communizer bullshit 101, because it's like this is the reason why I love reading the communizer stuff to a certain point, and then they start talking about like their understanding of the relationship of value to like social labor, and it's just like, what are you talking about? I'm unfortunately going to plug something once again. I actually wrote about this for the journal The Black Lamp. Viv's been on a bunch to talk about stuff that he's written for The Black Lamp. I wrote a criticism of what's it called? The endnotes piece that's name is Forest and Factory, that everybody loves, because it falls into this exact same trap, right? It gets very, very close to understanding what would need to change in terms of getting rid of private property relations and instituting, communal social relations. But then it balks because, and all communizers do this, Dove does this like all the time before in the later part of his life, being like, I don't actually understand labor time certificates. But then it gets up to that point and then it balks at labor time certificates because they look like money or because they sound like money, right? And it's like, if you don't have private property relations, you're not going to have the things that you're scared about with money because the law of value isn't going to operate. And, this is actually weirdly, this kind of comes from Kautsky, because Kautsky would be like, he kind of does the opposite, where he's like, so value will exist under socialism because we're measuring people's labor time. And it's like, no, dog. Like Engels is like, what are you talking about, you idiot? That's absolutely not the case. Just because you measure people's labor time, that doesn't mean you have capitalism, right? Just because you're measuring the work that somebody does, that does not mean that you have private property relations. And in fact, that's kind of the whole point, is that when you're using direct labor time as a measurement for your society, you do not have private property relations because it's impossible with private property relations. Anyway, done complaining about the communizers for now. What are you going to do?
The only other thing that kind of appeals to me in this text is something in the sort of addendum section at the end where he's talking about he's sort of, there are portions of this where he's critiquing the sort of Stalinist approach to saying you have to develop the the sort of productive forces, and then you can have socialism. And it sort of comes back to something we've touched on a few times in the past, where we sort of settled on the idea that because like communism is in some ways this sort of like is a process. As soon as you have the revolution, you need to institute like socialist communist social relations from the off in some way, or be like striving toward achieving that. And he sort of makes an interesting argument, mostly predicated again, a sort of on a kind of like um slightly not vague exactly assertion, but an assertion that if you have the conditions for the development of a revolutionary proletariat, as soon as you have the conditions for revolution, you have the conditions for bringing about a process that socializes production and creates socialism. And sort of he see although he's saying you need to have it, or in its ultimate form a socialist economy will be a global one and you can't really have socialism in one country. He is sort of saying that at any point in the history of capitalism, if there is the political process underway which can bring about socialism, i.e., a revolutionary proletariat, then you already have the conditions for socialism at any point in the history of capitalism, which is an idea that I've sort of entertained and been quite interested in the past. Sort of like attempting to define or set conditions upon when is it feasible to have socialism. And if we're defining socialism as a process of changing social relations, in this context consciously, towards socialist ones, he seems to be more erring toward the side of the argument that says this is possible at any point and isn't really predicated or contingent on some level of technological advancement being reached, but rather it's a question of new social relations rather than new forces of production coming into place, I guess.
Absolutely, yeah. And I would kind of also wonder if you could kind of take that even further back and be like, it's kind of possible. Like, there's no real reason why you couldn't just measure labor time whenever, you know what I mean, in a direct fashion like this. I mean, again, maybe it does get into questions of like productivity, maybe to a certain extent, but his point is a qualitative one. It's not a quantitative one, right? It's
Yeah,
based on social relations.
I've sort of come to think that there is something fundamental. There are conditions that the sort of onset of capitalism brings about. One of them being the separation of the bulk of humanity from private production predicated on ownership of personal means of production, I guess. So I think there are probably some historical shifts that um, are necessary, and that which mean that socialism in some ways can only be an outgrowth of capitalism, at least socialism under conditions that we understand it.
Yeah, I
but
see what you're saying.
but like it's interesting, like he quotes Marx quite a lot on this and saying, well, there's always been commodity production, people have always been producing commodities. It's only when commodity production becomes the sort of primary um, defining feature of your mode of production that you have capitalism. um,
And the
so it
separation of
yeah
like people like into wage laborers.
Yes, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Yeah. And I also think that, yeah, I suppose just like a general social division of labor too, because it would probably be pretty startling if you tried to tell a peasant, like, okay, now you have to do everything. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Or, you have to do one thing. Like, yeah,
yeah,
that'd
yeah.
probably be like, oh, maybe they couldn't actually do that. Um, yeah. Although it is also funny because then he just comes out and is like, but anyways, it's only possible if you have a world revolution. And then it's like,
Hmm.
oh, okay.
Yeah, like yeah, I don't know. For me, like I don't know. And what I mean, one day I'd like to like read something that like satisfactorily refutes for me the idea that you can't have socialism in one country.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
know it's like it's a it's a piece of Stalinist terminology, and so that scares people just from that standpoint. But like, if you have a sufficiently large economy to have an autarkic system, I don't understand.
Mm.
Yeah, I don't
I
understand.
think for a lot
Like,
of this,
yeah,
I had the same thought because I was just kind of like, LL Men, read Mike McNair because his just kind of hand waving thing is it can't be one country, it's got to be a continent.
yeah.
Which maybe his point there is that like you
Sure. I
need
mean,
all of the natural resources possible to build a modern economy under your
mhm,
control, and
mhm.
also there's a military thing there where it's like you need to be sufficiently large where you can't just be crushed. I don't know. I see
Yeah.
what you're
I
saying
mean,
though.
then it sort of comes down to yeah, what are the relationship? What yeah, yeah. I'd like. I mean, I'd like to have better worked out like no, like you would have. Do you then have two economic worlds that can't interact or whatever? And is that a bad thing? And does that always lead to like
Mm.
conflict or like?
Well, it seems like
But
too, right? Like,
these seem like questions that are detached from the sort of a pure question of um, uh, economic systems being an outgrowth of uh, social relations, you know, and the, like I don't know.
yeah, but I also think to your point that like surely if we actually believe in these social relations as getting rid of this indirect relative measuring of attempting to measure an absolute quantity of social labor and failing to be able to do that and competition and no coordination, surely then if you had a sufficiently big country, I guess, big country, not big computer, big country, then it would just be more efficient and more practical than a capitalist country and it would be able to outcompete them. That's kind of like
Mhm,
what I've always thought. It's like, but we're building a better society. So surely, unless it just got like atom bombed into oblivion on day one, surely it would be fine. Like,
mhm,
surely it would actually entice more people to want to do that.
mhm,
Unless the bourgeoisie is just like, everyone dies now and, nobody gets communism.
mhm.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess I can see a way in which if we set a definition for modern capitalism or capitalism in general, which is necessitates a certain imperialist relationship to a sort of peripheral world kind of thing. Um, if a if the transition of a portion of the world into um, socialism or communism or whatever we want to call it, if that were to then actually actively undermine the political economic longevity of the capitalist world by interfering with um, that necessity, I could see how uh, a communist portion of the world would threaten and then therefore attract the ire of a communist one, I guess. So, a capitalist one, I guess. Anyway.
Mm. It's a reverse Cuba. All the professionals want to come to the communist country. They go,
Exactly.
this is
Yeah.
better
Yeah. Yeah.
now that I'm not getting paid what I should be getting paid in a capitalist country. He gets into a little bit of stuff here about like how you treat complex labor and stuff. And I was a little bit worried that he was going to be a like wage differentials guy. And I'm very glad he wasn't because I'm just, yeah, that idea is just like, don't even try. I also wonder, like, because he gets into, how complex labor is actually, how can you actually go about comparing that to simple labor, right? And again, these aren't like moral categories. He's not being like, you're a piece of shit because you just like, I don't know, spread lie on the poop pile or something like that. Like, he's saying that complex labor just requires more training, so it requires more of society to actually make it. So therefore, it's like kind of a multiplier in terms of the amount of social labor that it imparts onto a product. I kind of wonder if you can just figure all of that stuff out and then just put it in the communist tax. I forget what they call it, the fundamental principles, but just like maybe that would cause people to be like, I'm getting taxed how much? But also like, I don't know, if people see that it takes X amount of time to train a brain surgeon and then they go, don't worry about that. Don't worry about that coming out of like the product that it creates being really expensive. We're just going to cover it and take it off of the labor hour. I kind of feel like that might be a better way to do it. I mean, again, I don't know how much that would like drastically reduce the labor hour in terms of how much you're getting. That might piss people off, but maybe that's just a good way to do it. Just be like, we'll cover it and we'll decide what we want to do.
Yeah, I don't know how many times we've come across this idea of simple and complex labor. Obviously, we've read a little bit of it with our minor foray into capital, but I think also Ruben talks about it a bit. I think, although I'm not entirely clear on it, I think there is the potential in this for clarifying and solving that question. I mean, I don't like the question very much because, like, creating this the seeming binary between simple and complex labor, you know, like all labor requires some amount of training.
Yeah, absolutely.
Everybody receives some degree of all. Like the majority of children receive some degree of state provided education, right? Like it's currently considered that you have to have a certain basis of quote unquote training, I suppose, to be a functional worker in the capitalist world. And then everybody learns skills on the job to do certain things.
Yeah,
So
it's not
really,
like you could just drop
it's just this
somebody.
big spectrum, and I mean, I don't then fully understand what the problem is necessarily. What accounting problem does it create? But the solution is there in in several forms. You're right. The most obvious one is just to say, well, let's just call it all a training, educational cost, and put it all in the under the category of like tax. That portion of the value. God, it's really slipping now. that portion of the sort of like the the labor, the sort of like quantity of labor that you are not given because it goes toward into the sort of general pool of labor hours that are going to be spent on whatever collective endeavor it's decided to spend them on. You know,
Yeah, I mean,
tax
again,
and state spending. This is what we're talking about.
yeah, exactly. And I don't think anybody like has a problem with public schools now, you know what I mean? So it's like you're kind of just extending that idea, right?
Yeah. Let's
And you
just
know,
decide we're going to pay for university education for
yeah, exactly. And it's
everybody who
like,
needs it up until the point when they're able to do the job that we need them to do, you know.
yeah, we'll get rid of MBAs. That will get rid of a whole lot of public spending. We'll get rid of business schools and we'll invest in brain surgeons, and that's pretty much it, right? Yeah. I completely agree. I kind of felt like it was making a mountain out of a molehill. It's like this is relatively simple, but again, he doesn't get into the idea of the like labor hour um, thing that they do in the fundamental principles, where it's like you're not remunerated for one total hour, you're remunerated for like 0.66 of an hour, because the 0.34 of that hour, 3.4, 4.4, whatever, that number is, you know, taken away to account for like the labor that goes into building a school or maintaining teachers or even just like planners, right? Because presumably that would come into it. And the great thing about that plan is that like you just decide that. Did you say podcasters?
The bureaucrats.
Oh, okay. Oh yeah, no, bureaucrats. Yeah, right. Yeah.
I wish I said podcasters.
Yeah, thank God. I wish get a stipend. But that's just like the great part about that plan, right? Is that like you can easily politically make that decision. And again, like this isn't getting rid of politics. We said this when we interviewed Donald about this stuff. Like the point isn't to get rid of politics. The point is to actually make politics like attractive and make it something that you can actually engage with, as opposed to like referencing or, you know, putting forward your preference for your choice between a psychopath or an idiot, as a wise man once said, every 4 years. So yeah, good stuff. Yeah. There you go.
Simpsons quote.
I don't think so. I think it's Hunter S. Thompson. I could be wrong.
Okay.
Well, what are you going to do? I will have this essay on my table at the London Anarchist Zine Fair or Book Fair or whatever they call it. It's a zine fair. And it will be very cheap because I fucked up the PDF. So come and get it and talk to me all about it. It would be very nice. All right. Well, Dan, anything else? Anything else to tell the people?
No. I think we've told them quite enough.
We've told them enough. Yeah. All right. Well, cool. I enjoyed this once again, Dan, and
Great.
I'm getting closer to being able to talk about this stuff. So much appreciated. Thank you.
We'll get there one day.
One day.
Thanks everybody for listening to our efforts. If you've made it this far.
See you.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Hey, everybody. Jack here. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. The song that you heard on this episode is Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. You can go ahead and check this song out much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. If you want to go ahead and get in touch with us, chat shit, tell us that we're wrong, whatever you want to do, you can go ahead and do that at auxiliarystatements@gmail.com. You can just send us a message there, or you can get in touch with us on Twitter, on Discord, on Instagram. You're a smart person. You can find these places. We got a YouTube. We post stuff there as well. Sometimes we stream. Thank you so much for listening. Till next time.